All right, so week 2 of our Ruth series. We're going to be talking about providence today, the idea of providence. About 2 months ago, I guess, Chantel and I and our daughters adopted from the local shelter a 10-month-old puppy. We have a French bulldog who is a complete grump and menace to society, and we wanted something better than that. And so we thought, let's try again. Sort of like how you do with kids, right? I'm joking. And so we ended up adopting a Pyrenees Husky Cross. We've named her Selah. And Selah pulled one of the greatest magic acts in the history of dogs on us. She presented herself to be a gentle, calm, no issues to be found type dog for 14 days. And then when we paid for her, everything changed. And what we have discovered about Selah is she hates other dogs except for the grumpy French bulldog. And she hates being alone. Like, seriously, her separation anxiety is off the charts. And so we have been doing a number of things and all these recommended things that you're to do with dogs like this. And we had found that she seemed to be not so bad if she could be in the car with us. So we would go into the grocery store and come back, and she had been fine. And we were doing that for longer periods of time. Well, she came to church last week and was in the back of our Ford Explorer. And by the time that Chantel and my daughters went out to the car to leave, she had chewed the headrest of the seat. Almost to it. It just needs to be completely replaced. I just have to get a new captain chair for the third or the middle row. Yeah, so I don't know, we laugh about it and stuff, but in the moment you're kind of incredibly angry and sort of devastated and feeling already financially sort of impacted. And she's in the car again today, if anyone would like to go meet her, because we aren't smart. But here's where we're going with this story. It was genuinely really kind of devastating for us because we really like her, but you can't just destroy all our stuff. And so this has been a thing where I've actually genuinely, not to sound super spiritual, but really prayed that, God, you've got to redeem this. I talk to Chantel all the time that one of the great privileges of people, the imago Dei, the image of God in us, is that we actually care for creation, that we take dominion over his creation that he has called good, including orphan animals that don't otherwise have people to care for them. And so I'm going God, we're trying to even in this simple way, express your image on the earth to your creation, and you've got to help us. And so I've prayed genuinely that God would actually redeem this, that good would come from this, that somehow, because I'm part of a different kingdom, Chantel and our kids are part of a different kingdom, the kingdom of God, there would be redemption in this otherwise very frustrating and potentially expensive, setback, we could say. Now, the funny thing is I suspect that God will come through in one way or another. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't expect to go out one morning and see a whole new seat magically, appear in our vehicle. But I'm asking that God would come through. But what I suspect is that when he does, it may take me a while to notice that he's done just that. And maybe you relate to this. Maybe there have been circumstances or breakthroughs or surprises, and you chalk it up as chance. And it's not until later, if at all, that you come to see that it wasn't chance at all, but it was actually an expression of God's care for you, for the people you love, for your life, for your church, for your business, whatever it may be. Or maybe in a similar vein, you have thought at times that it's not so much that my life is full of God's grace, but it's more full of happy accidents. Or maybe you think you just make your own luck. You manifest your own story in your own situation. You create your own favor and your own grace. And whatever we credit for those pleasant surprises that work things together for our good, the truth is that it's always an act of God's providence in our life. Always. Now, providence is sort of a fancy word. Especially in the theological arena. So let me give you a really basic definition of providence in case you don't really know exactly what I'm talking about, which would be fine. So providence, generally defined, is God's activity throughout history in providing for the needs of human beings, especially those who follow him in faith. God's activity throughout history providing for the needs of human beings, especially those who follow him in faith. So that's really what we're going to talk about today, is God's providence in the lives of the world, the people rather in the world, but especially in the lives of his people. So what I want to invite you to consider before we get too deep into this story that Pastor Brianne read for us is, what is it that you believe about God's providence? Do you believe God's providential? Do you believe that God is your provider, your director, and active, in fact, in all things in your life? Now, this is a big topic, and so I'm not going to get into all this. Now, I'm not talking about that he's behind all the evil or setbacks or illnesses or sickness in your life. That's not what I'm talking about. God is not the author of evil. But he can work all things together for the good of those he loves. That's what I'm talking about, okay? Do you believe that? Do you believe that God maybe is only sometimes providential? Like every now and then he drops a little bit of providential care into your life, but most of the time, no, not really, that's just you. Or maybe furthermore, you believe that God saved your soul, and he saved you from sin, and one day you're going to enjoy all the amazing spoils of that victory over death and sin, but this life, all the stuff here on earth, well, that's yours to sort out. You don't even really ever think about God's providential care. Likely some of us, all of us, fall into various spots within all of those possibilities, and probably ones I haven't mentioned. But my hope is that when this message is complete, you will be reminded for your sake, but always for God's glory, that his providence, the providential care of God, touches, in fact, our needs today and our needs both big and small in the future too. And I hope to highlight just a couple places for you, just a couple places where you can look and go, man, this is a place I think where I can see God's care, where I can see his providence at work, should you want to explore it. Okay, so we don't have time to work through this chapter verse by verse. It's 22 chapters, I believe, in chapter 22. We read 20 of them, and we're not going to go through every single verse because we'd be here most of the morning. So I'm going to focus on certain verses and try to fill in the gaps of the story as we go this morning, okay? So our first point today that we are going to kick off with is that God's providence is seen through unexpected favor, unexpected places of favor. So Ruth 2:2, Ruth says to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Not just let me go get to work, but let me go get to work in such a way that I would find someone in whose eyes I find favor. Okay, so let me bring you up to speed. Ruth and Naomi have left Moab. This is where we picked up last week. And they headed to Bethlehem. And so now at this point in the story, they have arrived in Bethlehem. And if you remember from last week, the reason that they left Moab was because they were kind of double-H'd, we could say. They were husbandless and they were hungry. And they needed to find provision, literally for their well-being, but also just simply for their stomachs. And so good news for them, when they get to Bethlehem, it just so happens that it is the barley harvest. And so there is food to be had, food they have not seen in a long time. So there's opportunity to be fed. So Ruth makes this plan that we see here in verse 2 to go and gather leftover grain. Not the fresh grain, but this leftover grain that has fallen to the ground while the harvesters have been collecting it. And this is maybe an interesting idea. Get the leftovers, not the first go through. But it really wasn't an unusual idea because the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, had specific instructions of what we could call compassion for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. And one of those instructions was that harvesters were to deliberately leave grain in the corners of their fields for the vulnerable and the destitute to come and collect. And they weren't to go back and gather those ears of grain that they might have dropped. They were to just leave them for those who might be in need and were hungry. So being then that Ruth was both a widow and a foreigner, She qualifies for this care, we could say. She qualified for the program. But unfortunately, as you know, not everyone in life follows the rules. Not everyone follows what God would have us do towards fellow humans. And so even though being a foreigner and a widow qualifies Ruth to go and pick up this fallen grain, it also makes her very vulnerable to mistreatment because she has no one to look out for her. She is completely vulnerable, destitute, and at the mercy of anybody. And so she qualifies, but she's also sort of vulnerable and in danger, we could say. So she needs favor. She needs to find favor in someone's eyes, not just to go get the grain, but that it would be through the eyes of someone in whom she finds favor. Now we talk about favor, what we're talking about here is grace. We're talking about this undeserved care, grace upon our lives. And so Ruth needs someone to extend grace to her, even though she has nothing to offer. There's no merit. There's nothing here that would say, I deserve your care, I deserve your favor, I deserve your grace. She's got nothing. So she goes off in hope of food, but even more so we could say bleed in hope of favor. Ruth finds a field. And not knowing who it belongs to, she proceeds to collect the grain that dropped by the harvesters, just as she said she would do. And then eventually a man named Boaz, here enters our third main character in the story in the book of Ruth. Boaz shows up, the owner of this field. And he notices Ruth. And he asks who is she? He asks his foreman, say what they call the overseer. And this overseer explains her situation, who she is. And then Boaz begins to speak to Ruth. And we could say the story really starts to get off the ground at this point. So we're going to jump in at verse 8 now and read through, I believe, 13. So Boaz says to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. And don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. A beautiful verse. Ruth replies, may I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. Favor, grace, no merit, yet given anyways. I find it pretty wild that even though we can't say for certain that Boaz knew Ruth's name even, he acknowledges her, he notices her, and he begins to speak to her. She's a widow, she's a foreigner, she does not deserve this, she is not entitled to this, but he does it anyways. And this was anything but a cool, sort of standoffish greeting, like, hello Ruth, thanks for coming today, or a formal business-like address, like, yes, go on, carry on, we will permit you to be here. Boaz addresses Ruth as my daughter. I mean, when do we ever call strangers our son or our daughter? But Boaz does this because he wants to break down the barriers between Ruth and himself. And he wants to be a person who speaks grace into her life. Additionally, calling her daughter indicates right away that Boaz feels a sense of responsibility for this widowed foreigner, that there's something he has to do here. Ruth is a Moabite, and he knows it, but he also knows that as a widow, someone not of this part of town, so to speak, she is in need of grace, which he then extends to her by way of protection and provision, sort of a double act of favor. So this is what he does for her. First, he instructs Ruth not to go anywhere, not to glean another field. He says, you have no need to leave at all. Don't go anywhere. Stay right here. Be in my field. Be amongst my people. This is where you got to stick around. Then he instructs her to stay close to his regular female servants and to keep an eye on where his male harvesters are harvesting, and then follow the women and do as they do. Become one of the group. Third, he ensures Ruth that she's not to worry about harassment from the male workers. And this is more than just like, oh, they're going to tease you. I read one commentator say this is probably the first sexual harassment policy ever instituted. This was, in the original language, heavier than just they might not be kind. Like, in every possible way the men could misbehave to you, I'm going to shut it down, is what he's saying. And remember, she's a foreigner, a widow. She's got no one to stick up for her. She's vulnerable. And then fourth, Boaz says, Ruth may drink freely from the water that is provided for Boaz's regular employees. Again, she's a foreigner and a woman. I don't have time to go into it, but they didn't just drink interchangeably all willy-nilly casually at the water cooler like they do at the government of the Northwest Territories. They had policies and protocols. Foreigners, women, men, they all drank at different times. So for him to just say, help yourself, it's tremendous generosity and grace. So in all of this then, Boaz is providing Ruth with favor that she knew she needed. He's the person who's looking upon her situation with great grace. To Ruth, this destitute widow from a foreign land, Boaz gives dignity, and he treats Ruth as a significant person, equal with his hired employees, who are likely Israelites, not foreigners. So he treats her as a local and one of his own. And if that's not favor, I don't really know how we can define it, because she doesn't deserve any of it. There's nothing that entitles her to any of this. But she finds exactly what she hopes to find, what she needed to find, what she knew she would need as she began that journey with her mother-in-law all the way back in Moab, walking to this land not her own. I love in verse 13, Ruth is thanking him, and she says, because I don't have the standing of your servants. You've done this for me. You've extended this to me, and I don't have the standing of your servants. She knows and acknowledges that there's nothing about her that should cause Boaz to do this. He just did it. He just did it for her. But church, it's Ruth seemingly by chance finding a favor through Boaz that reveals to us, the reader, all these years later, God's providence in this story. God's providence is observed in the unexpected grace, this unexpected favor that she wasn't entitled to. She had no standing. But it invites us to think about God's hand all over her life. You remember that Ruth had stuck with Naomi all the way to this land not her own. They're hungry and they needed to find some food. So she starts looking for some. But she's also looking for grace ultimately. It's not just that she needed to be filled, she needed grace for this next season of her life. And so rather than bumbling and stumbling and facing abuse and mistreatment and saying, oh man, I just hope I find something to eat today, she walks into a field and finds this guy named Boaz who shows her favor like she never would have expected. Don't lose sight in this story that as great and heroic as Boaz is, the true hero of this story is God. God's the one at work here. God's providence is the one that leads Ruth right into this field with this man named Boaz. It's God's providence that leads her, draws her, calls her to the person of grace. God's providence that leads her through a very difficult situation into a field of opportunity. God's the hero. In addition to God being the hero, we see that grace isn't a happy accident in our lives. Whether it's Ruth or anyone else, when extraordinary grace is found, deposited, released, favor falls on your life, it's because of God's providence. It's because God knows that we need it. Great favor extended towards us should always then be a place when grace falls on us and we go, man, that was favor, that was grace on my life. I didn't deserve it, but it happened to me. That is a place to notice God caring for you and his hand upon your comings and your goings. Next, God's providence is seen in unexpected inclusion. We'll look at verses 14 through 18. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here. Have some bread. Dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. And that's with his own hand, by the way, in the original language. This isn't just, hey, help yourself. This is him actually extending the grain with his hands to her. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. So as we talked about, Boaz had been very kind and generous to Ruth, made it easy for her to safely collect food from his field, meet her most pressing need. And that would have been enough. If that's all Boaz ever did for her, that would have been enough. That was a gracious, generous act. But he goes further. Boaz invites her to dine with him. The meal starts normal enough. But as it went on, the actions of Boaz likely surprised everyone, including Ruth. Here's why. First of all, he invites Ruth, who you remember was an outsider and a Moabite, to come close and join him and his crew and eat with them. Because she was an outsider and he has to call her over, it's likely that Ruth was keeping her distance, that she was sitting a ways away by herself, possibly just eating whatever she'd collected, sorting it out on her own, resting, but doing so by herself. Sort of this lonely posture of, I'm just glad they let me be here. Maybe I don't want to be noticed any more than this. I'll just sit over here. But Boaz sees her and he calls to her, even as an outsider, even as a Moabite, even as not one of his own. And he says, come and be part of the group, sit with us, dine with us. And then he invites her to share the food that had been prepared for his people, his workers. He invites her to enjoy the bread and to dip it in the wine vinegar, which may have been drink, also may have been like a special sauce to flavor and moisten the bread. But the point here is that he invites her, an outsider, not one of the group, one without standing, to enjoy his pleasant food that was reserved and prepared for his people. Additionally, when Ruth had taken her seat as one now included, Boaz personally, as I said, serves her food himself. He didn't have to do this. This would not have been normal, but he says, here, have some of what I have, right from my own hands. He gives her enough food in that moment, we read, to satisfy her and to have enough left over, which the narrator includes here to just tell us that Boaz was incredibly generous with her. Now, this meal scene is, of course, much more significant than to simply say Boaz was a great host. Very, very, very good, dinner host. Very, very good dinner party thrower. The scene again is showing us God's providence in somebody's life, in Ruth's life. Ruth's hungry. She needs food. But because of God's providence, she doesn't just find something to eat. She finds someone to include her, to cause her to belong. She finds someone who extends to her gracious, kind, inclusive generosity while meeting her practical need. She finds someone who lets her collect from what is his, but also someone who would be invited to eat at his table, we could say. And you can understand, he could have just tossed her bread and said, yeah, there you go, lady, hit the road, that's all I've got for you. But he doesn't. He welcomes her. He includes her as one of his own. Now, you may remember in chapter 1, Naomi prayed that God would extend his hesed to her daughter-in-laws. She prays it because they had extended hesed to her. You remember hesed is the Hebrew word talking about loyal love or loving kindness, faithful love. And so in this moment, we actually see Naomi's prayer being answered. That God's faithfulness and loyal love starts to come all over Ruth's life. Through Boaz, through his grace and inclusion towards Ruth, at a time when she so desperately needs it, God's loyal love is present and working behind the scenes. This inclusion of Ruth at the table, so to speak, demonstrates that God does care for his people. He brings them to places where they can belong, to places where they can be included. But he does so in ways and at times the way that he sees fit based on what he knows. And as is so often true for us, God's providence isn't noticed at first. It's not seen always. It may have seemed like luck or chance in this moment as she sits there going, I can't believe what's happening to me. But eventually Ruth comes to learn that this is the hand of the true God acting on her behalf, acting on behalf of a desperate lady with no standing for her sake, but also, as she'll learn, for the sake of God's plans that are going to come through her very life. Ruth didn't ever expect to find this type of inclusion when she wandered away from Moab, trying to look out for her mother-in-law. She didn't expect to find it when she wandered into the field that day going, well, I guess I'll start here. But she did, included, belonged, fed, because this is what God does. He cares for people in the ordinary, seemingly boring, bland, uneventful rhythms of life, in ways that we would think are just random chance, in ways that we would think are just happy accidents. God is at work. Now, in the case of favor and inclusion, God's providence causes Ruth to be taken care of in her today. But there's also a bigger story at work where God, through his providence, is now also starting to take care of Ruth's tomorrows as well, which leads directly to our third point. God's providence is seen in unexpected redemption. 19 and 20. She gets back to wherever they're staying. And her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she said she'd been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, he has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead, she added. That man is our close relative, and he is one of our guardian redeemers. So we're not going to spend too much time on this point, because we're going to spend more time on this week. But it is such an important detail, this redemption stuff, that we got to touch on it, I think, in both weeks. So Naomi asks, where have you been? Where'd you work? Who let you collect all this food? She says it's Boaz. And then Naomi gets really excited about this. And she says that Boaz is a close relative. Boaz is and she uses this term, guardian redeemer. Other translations would say kinsman redeemer. And this is an important detail, because a guardian redeemer was a near relative who would take on the economic responsibility and well-being of a relative, particularly when a relative was in distress and could not get himself or herself out of that crisis that they were in. And so this is actually a custom, the custom of redemption. Oh my goodness, does our society need the custom of redemption? The custom of redemption was instituted among God's people, among the Israelites, to maintain the wholeness and the health of family relationships, even if someone had died who was responsible to take care of that group of people. And so Ruth saw Boaz as this kind, generous man who showed favor and included her and gave her a bunch of food to eat, met her need for that day. But Naomi knows who Boaz is. And she sees him as an even bigger answer to their needs, because he's someone who should possibly, technically he has to take care of them going forward. Naomi believes that there is a chance he's going to do more than just fill their stomachs, but he may just redeem the whole situation. That he may be the answer to everything turning around for these two ladies. And so in this glimmer of hope for redemption, as Naomi's heart kind of comes to life again, we see God's providential care. He cares for Ruth and Naomi in the moment. He directs Ruth into this field of Boaz where she's fed well, but he also directs Ruth into a field of a guy who will be responsible to redeem their whole lives. Boaz wasn't just gracious, Boaz becomes redemptive for these ladies. So as I said, we'll talk a bit more about redemption next week, but the last bit of time I have this morning, I want to move us back to the beginning of this message. I mentioned that oftentimes God leads us and guides us and even redeems these really hard experiences and circumstances, but those times when God does this, we're sometimes really slow to notice. We don't seem to notice God or credit God because for some reason, and I don't know why we're into this, we would rather credit fate or coincidence or serendipity or chance than God's hand. I have no idea why. But I want to remind you that chance is God's providence in disguise, we could say. Whatever chance is. Look at these verses all the way back, halfway through 2 and then 3. So this is, Ruth hashes her plan, I'm going to go find a field. Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. Then it says, as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So we've looked at God's providential attention of Ruth and Naomi, and I'm purposely drawing you back to the beginning of this chapter, all the way back to the start, to show you a portion of a verse that you likely missed as just part of the detail of this story. In the second half of verse 3 is found one of the most significant comments in the entire book of Ruth, because it's the statement that highlights how God works in ordinary details of life. So verse 3 reads, so she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. And here's the important part. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. A more literal translation of as it turned out would be like this. And her chance chanced upon. And her chance chanced upon. The allotted portion of the field was Boaz's. In modern idiom, if we were to say this in our vernacular, it would say something like, by a stroke of luck, she ended up at Boaz's place. At this point on the surface then, the narrator seems to be telling us that by complete fluke, Ruth wandered into Boaz's field, a guy who was their relative. Now there's some really thick irony in this statement because Israel doesn't believe in chance and luck. Nowhere in the Old Testament will you find them endorsing the idea of fate or chance or luck. They didn't believe that. They thought God's hand touched absolutely everything. So why would a Hebrew writer, narrator say by a stroke of luck or by an act of chance she wanders in here? It doesn't even make sense. They wouldn't believe that. They wouldn't endorse that. They wouldn't present that to their readers. So why do they do it? Scholars believe that this is a deliberate rhetorical device on the part of the author, on the part of the narrator. And what they think he was doing or she was doing is by saying chance, when he says chance is responsible for Ruth's good fortune, he focuses and forces the reader on this interesting line and forces us to go, that doesn't make any sense. Because if you've been tracking along with this story, you've seen God at work. In 2 chapters, we've gone, oh, look what God's doing for them. And so then you read this little line and go, oh, by chance she did? You go, no, it's not by chance. That doesn't make any sense. And so what it does then is this little tiny verse, especially if you're reading it in Hebrew, challenges the purely rational explanations for happy accidents that we seem to come up with all the time. And it says that God is at work. I love the way that Daniel Block describes this little verse here, what's going on. Talking about the narrator, he says, he is screaming, "See the hand of God at work here." And her chance upon chance, see the hand of God at work here. The same hand that had sent the famine, later provided food, is the hand that brought Naomi and Ruth to Bethlehem precisely at the beginning of the harvest, and now guided Ruth to the portion of the field belonging specifically to Boaz. See the hand of God. And it just so happened. I love how the narrator sort of dresses God's providence up in chance's clothing, we could say. He almost disguises providence so that the readers and the hearers of this story, like us today, have to stop and say, wait a minute. God's all over that. That's not just that it just happened. God's in this. This can't just be an accident. God's in the story. And that little experience of stopping and saying, hey, I don't think that that's just chance. That is a really good lesson for us. Because it's the same experience, the experience of crediting chance with providence's recognition, that is so common in our day-to-day lives, even among those who worship the true God. Something good happens, something unexpected goes right, and we tell others, you won't believe what happened. Because we don't believe what happened. And then others will respond with, oh, what are the chances? And then they'll say something like this. You've probably heard this one or maybe said it. Oh, you should buy a lottery ticket, we say. In other words, you seem lucky. It's fascinating how Christians love to point to chance and fluke rather than seeing chance, fluke, coincidence, and serendipity as God's providence in disguise. Remember, Ruth isn't a pleasant story church on chance and on luck. It's a testimony to the truth that God is involved and working out his care for people and his plan in history in the day-to-day lives of ordinary people. God, through this story, brings the line of David, the line of Jesus Christ, and the way it's put is, and it just so happened. So to bring this message to a close, I want to do as we did last week and circle back to this series title, which is Jesus in the Details. These little stops along the way to prepare us for Advent. And so we've talked about the providence of Yahweh in the life of Ruth and Naomi today. But I want to conclude this morning by considering how this chapter also points us to Jesus as the ultimate, hear me, Jesus as the ultimate act of God's providential care for his people. So here it is. We talked about Ruth's chance upon chance, walking into a field belonging to someone who showed favor, welcomed her at his table, and would eventually redeem her story. But today I wonder how many of you see the gospel in this story. Furthermore, I wonder how many of you see yourself in this story, specifically wearing Ruth's shoes. If you can't, I'm going to help you. You see, you also at one time in your life came to the realization that you needed to find someone to look upon you with grace. Some point in your life you were going, I don't know how I'm going to do this anymore, and you said, I've got to find favor. I need to find someone whose eyes will fall upon me and say, grace will be extended. I've got to find someone who will extend me grace even though I have nothing to give. I don't have any standing. I don't have any merit. I don't even deserve to be here. I need to find someone who will look at me with favor nonetheless. Time in your life when you came to see that even though you had nothing and you were an outsider, you're invited in as an insider just the same as everybody else. You may remember at one time you were wandering with no direction, a foreigner in a country not your own, so to speak. Yet you found yourself wandering right into a kingdom belonging to a kind and gracious Lord, who called you daughter or son, ordered that no harm come to you while you hang out in their territory, and invited you to enjoy the excess of his bounty. At one time you also sat alone, at a distance, excluded, on the outside, with nowhere to belong until you heard the voice of a king and gentle lord call to you and say, "Come here. Join us. Dip your bread in the wine. Eat until you are full. Let me serve you from my own hands." And finally, you also, after experiencing Jesus' grace and inclusion, his kindness, his favor upon you, came to realize that this person is not just loving and kind and generous and interesting. This person is going to redeem my very life that had at one time likely seemed hopeless and lost. The narrator tells us in the case of Ruth that it just so happened that Ruth experienced favor, that is grace over merit, inclusion over exclusion, and redemption over loss. But so have you. That's your story on the slide right there. It just so happened that you wandered right into God's grace, found a place of fellowship and belonging at his table, and now you live with hope and comfort that Jesus is today, tomorrow, and forever the only one responsible, able, and willing to redeem your very life. All the setbacks, all your chewed seats. So friends, my simple encouragement today is don't count on chance. Don't count on chance. Because there's just no lasting hope in chance. If you're waiting for an accident, stop waiting. Chance doesn't love you. Accidents don't care about you. Fate doesn't know your future. Only God does. And because God does, and because God can, he acts, and he acts for you, and he is acting for you, even now. Throughout history, God has upheld, and this is such an amazing thing, the lives of the great kings and queens and leaders. And he's also concerned himself equally with the lowly, with the meek, the destitute, and with those without any standing, just the same. So today, don't give chance your precious hope and your precious glory. Don't testify to chance's uniqueness and its surprising appearance in your life. Instead, give your hope and your glory to the God whose providence so often appears in disguise, offering favor to people so desperately